This week, the United States Bureau of Reclamation reported that Lake Powell remains near 22% capacity, leaving Glen Canyon Dam with a rapidly narrowing margin above a critical operating threshold. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The reservoir is already below the elevation federal managers use as a protective buffer for power generation. Earlier projections showed that without major intervention, the water could fall below 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool, as early as this summer. Reclamation has responded by changing dam operations and ordering additional releases from upstream reservoirs. Those actions reduced the immediate risk. They did not rebuild the missing water. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is 22% capacity. The hidden number is the shrinking vertical distance between the lake surface and the turbine cutoff. As that distance contracts, the hydraulic force driving the generators weakens before the turbines stop completely. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a grid margin test moving downstream. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell will cross one line on a federal chart. The question is, what happens as flexible hydropower becomes weaker, while summer heat raises electricity demand, wildfire threatens transmission lines, and public utilities search for more expensive replacement power? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this falling reservoir is revealing where the Western power system may begin losing room to maneuver. At first light, the warning does not appear as a siren. It appears as a line of numbers moving across federal screens: lake elevation, storage volume, inflow, release, forecast range. Each number describes water, but together they describe something larger: how much freedom remains inside one of the most important operating systems in the American West. The first screen belongs to the United States Bureau of Reclamation, the agency responsible for operating Glen Canyon Dam. Its measurements show Lake Powell holding only a fraction of the water it was designed to store. The reservoir that once reached an elevation of 3,700 feet has been operating near 3,525 feet, the target level federal managers use as a protective buffer for hydropower. 35 feet below that target is minimum power pool, at 3,490 feet. The turbines at Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate electricity through their normal operating pathway. That is the first warning light. The second appears upstream. In late April, Reclamation began drought response releases from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, hundreds of river miles away. This is not water arriving because the basin suddenly became wet. It is stored water being released deliberately from another federal reservoir to defend Lake Powell against a more dangerous decline. Flaming Gorge is not an unlimited reserve. By early July, it stood near 3/4 of its own live storage capacity, while its June inflow was only about 31% of average. Water used to protect one reservoir is therefore leaving another reservoir that must also serve communities, ecosystems, recreation, and power production. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. A low reservoir in Arizona and Utah, a controlled release from Wyoming and Utah, a poor inflow month in the upper Colorado Basin. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The system is borrowing elevation from upstream to preserve operating room downstream. By the time that second warning light appears, another agency is already watching the consequences. The Western Area Power Administration, part of the United States Department of Energy, markets and transmits hydropower from the Colorado River Storage Project. It does not simply sell electricity from one dam to one nearby town. Its high-voltage network and power contracts connect federal hydropower to municipalities, tribal utilities, irrigation districts, military facilities, public power agencies, and rural electric cooperatives across a wide region. Those organizations then serve homes, farms, businesses, hospitals, and water systems. When Glen Canyon produces less electricity, the effect does not travel outward like a dark wave, switching off every light in its path. It begins more quietly. Schedules change. Available generation shrinks. Operators look for replacement electricity. Costs move. The amount of power that can be increased quickly becomes smaller. The grid keeps operating, but it operates with fewer inexpensive choices. That is why the operations room matters. The public sees a blue line retreating down sandstone walls. Federal managers see a narrowing set of options. In April, one federal projection showed that under a severely dry inflow scenario, Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool as early as August without major intervention. The projected annual inflow in that scenario was less than 1/3 of the historical average. That forecast did not become destiny. Reclamation changed the monthly release pattern at Glen Canyon, held additional water in Lake Powell, and activated upstream drought response operations. Updated projections then placed the reservoir above minimum power pool through the end of the year. That sounds like the warning disappeared. It did not. The intervention changed the projected date. It did not restore the hydrology that forced the intervention. This is the unusual detail. An operational success can conceal a worsening physical condition. The line on the forecast moves upward because managers release less water from one dam and more water from another. The basin itself has not produced the missing supply. The system has rearranged scarcity. That distinction is easy to miss because the dashboard contains several kinds of numbers at once. There are observed measurements, showing where the reservoir is now. There are forecasts, showing where it may go under different inflow conditions. There are operating decisions, showing how much water managers intend to release. And there are thresholds, marking where equipment, contracts, laws, and emergency plans begin to behave differently. A casual glance can blend them into one story. The operations room cannot. Managers must ask, what happens if the snowmelt underperforms? If summer evaporation rises? If tributary flows weaken? Or if next winter begins dry? They must also ask what happens elsewhere, when water is held back at Glen Canyon. Releases from Lake Powell help supply Lake Mead and support obligations to the lower Colorado River basin. Protecting one elevation can place pressure on another reservoir, another schedule, or another group of water users. Every defensive action has a direction. Every direction has someone downstream. The most visible number that morning may be 22% capacity, but capacity alone does not run the system. Elevation determines whether water can reach the turbines with enough hydraulic head. Release volume determines how much water moves toward Lake Mead. Inflow determines whether storage can recover. Timing determines whether the water arrives when electricity demand is highest. Forecast uncertainty determines how aggressively managers can act before the next season is known. This is why a single percentage cannot describe the emergency. A reservoir may contain millions of acre-feet and still be dangerously close to an operating boundary. It may continue generating power while producing less energy from the same amount of water. It may remain above minimum power pool while the agencies around it are already spending water, money, and flexibility to prevent it from crossing that line. Then another signal enters the room. Summer demand is rising. Across the West, air conditioners begin drawing more electricity during long, hot afternoons. Solar generation can provide enormous amounts of power while the sun is high, but demand often remains elevated as evening arrives and solar output falls. Hydropower is valuable in that transition because operators can change generation quickly. Glen Canyon is not the only resource capable of doing that, and the Western grid does not depend on one dam alone. But removing or weakening a large, flexible generator makes the balancing problem harder, especially when heat, wildfire, transmission constraints, plant outages, or market prices are applying pressure at the same time. This is where the reservoir map becomes an electrical map. The warning is not that every home connected to federal hydropower will suddenly lose electricity. The warning is that each lost unit of dependable low-cost generation must be replaced by something else. That replacement may be natural gas generation. It may be electricity purchased through a regional market. It may be stored energy from batteries. It may be reduced consumption during a critical hour. Each option has a price, a limit, and a time when it is available. The weaker Glen Canyon becomes, the more often operators must reach for those alternatives. The operations room is therefore watching two clocks. One measures the descent of the lake. The other measures how quickly the power system can build substitutes. New transmission lines take years. Large generating projects require permits, equipment, financing, and construction. Batteries can be deployed more quickly, but they must be charged before they can discharge, and their duration matters during long periods of high demand. Energy efficiency reduces load, but buildings and appliances are replaced gradually. Water can fall faster than infrastructure can be redesigned. That is the tension hidden inside the dashboard. The current operating actions may keep Lake Powell above the turbine cutoff this season. They cannot guarantee that the next sequence of dry months will offer the same room to maneuver, nor can upstream reservoirs repeatedly surrender water without approaching their own limits. The map shows several reservoirs. The system sees one connected account. A withdrawal in one place becomes protection somewhere else. And a protection today can become a vulnerability later. By late morning, the federal screens may show no blackout, no failed turbine, and no broken transmission line. Yet the system has already changed. Water releases have been reordered. Upstream storage has been committed. Electricity planners are calculating replacement costs. Utilities are measuring exposure. Engineers are studying operating limits that once seemed distant. Several warning lights are on, even though the room is still quiet. And that is the point. The day Lake Powell crosses a famous threshold would be dramatic. The more important story begins before that day. While the dam is still generating, the grid is still functioning, and every agency involved is working harder to preserve what used to exist automatically. The question is not only whether the warning lights will turn red, it is how much of the system has already been rearranged to keep them amber. To understand that, the next number cannot remain a percentage on a reservoir chart. It must be translated into water volume, vertical distance, mechanical force, and electricity that can no longer be produced in the same way. 22% sounds like a simple fraction, but Lake Powell is not a glass filled to a visible line. It is a flooded canyon system more than 180 miles long, with steep walls, submerged tributaries, side channels, shelves, narrows, and deep cuts carved into sandstone. That shape changes the meaning of every foot the reservoir loses. Near the top, a small decline in elevation can uncover an enormous horizontal area. Lower down, the canyon narrows. So the same vertical decline may represent a different volume of water. This is why the headline number must be taken apart before it can be understood. According to the United States Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Powell is considered full at an elevation of 3,700 feet above sea level. At that level, the reservoir can hold more than 24 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot is the amount needed to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. It equals about 326,000 gallons. That unit sounds abstract until it is multiplied. 1 million acre-feet is roughly 326 billion gallons. 5 million acre-feet is more than 1.6 trillion gallons. Even at roughly 22% capacity, Lake Powell still holds a quantity of water so large that it is difficult to picture. But that is exactly where misunderstanding begins. A large remaining volume does not mean a large operating margin. The reservoir can still contain trillions of gallons and remain dangerously close to the elevation where its most important functions begin to weaken. The number is not just storage. It is storage positioned inside a machine. Glen Canyon Dam was built to use the height difference between the lake and the river below. Water enters through large intake structures, accelerates through steel penstocks, and pushes against turbine blades. The greater the vertical distance, the more potential energy the water carries. When the lake is high, gravity provides a stronger push. When the lake falls, the water still moves, but the hydraulic head becomes smaller. The generator receives less force from each unit of water. That means 22% capacity is not simply the absence of 78% of the reservoir. It is a transformation in how the remaining water can work. Imagine a heavy object being dropped from the roof of a tall building, and then from a lower floor. The object has the same mass, but it releases less energy from the lower height. The comparison is imperfect, but the principle is the same. Water at a lower elevation has less potential energy available to convert into electricity. The lake does not have to vanish for the power plant to lose strength. The loss begins 1 foot at a time. This is why elevation matters as much as volume. If Lake Powell is near 3,525 feet, its surface is about 175 feet below full pool. That is not merely a lower shoreline. It is a major reduction in the vertical energy available above the turbines. Federal managers use 3,525 feet as an important protective target because it provides operating room above minimum power pool. Minimum power pool is 3,490 feet. The difference between those two elevations is 35 feet. On a highway, 35 feet is barely more than the length of a bus. On a reservoir chart, it is the space between continued normal hydropower operations and a threshold the system was never designed to approach regularly. This is the comparison that changes the emotional weight of the number. Lake Powell may appear enormous from the air. A boat can still travel through miles of open water. The dam can still release water. The turbines can still produce electricity. Yet the vertical margin protecting those turbines may be measured in only a few dozen feet. The visible landscape is vast. The critical operating space is narrow. That is the abnormal pattern. 22% capacity would already be serious in any major reservoir. But Lake Powell is not only a storage basin. It is part of a linked water and power system serving 7 basin states, tribal nations, farms, cities, ecosystems, and public power customers. The remaining water has several jobs at once. It must help meet downstream delivery requirements. It must support hydropower. It must maintain enough elevation for safe dam operations. It must preserve flexibility for future dry years. And it must do all of this, while the river entering the reservoir may deliver far less than the 20th century average used to design the system. 1 gallon cannot perform all of those jobs independently. Once released downstream, it is no longer stored at Lake Powell. Once held back, it cannot simultaneously raise Lake Mead. Once used to protect one operating target, it may reduce flexibility somewhere else. This is why the percentage becomes more dangerous when placed inside a calendar. Reservoirs are built to move water through time. Snow falls in winter. It melts in spring. The reservoir captures part of that runoff. Managers release water through summer, autumn, and the following winter. A healthy storage system does not merely survive a dry month. It carries water from wet periods into dry ones and from wet years into drought. But when storage falls near 22%, the calendar begins to lose its cushion. A weak runoff year is no longer absorbed by a deep reserve. It arrives directly in the operating room. Every disappointing snow survey matters more. Every month of high release matters more. Every hot period that increases evaporation matters more. The reservoir becomes less able to separate today from next year. The number is not just water missing from a lake, it is time missing from the system. That lost time can be measured in planning choices. With a fuller reservoir, managers can tolerate a poor forecast while waiting for more information. With a low reservoir, waiting becomes risky. Decisions must be made earlier, often under wider uncertainty. Should releases from Glen Canyon be reduced to protect elevation? Should more water be released from Flaming Gorge or other upstream reservoirs? Should power customers prepare to buy more electricity on the market? Should maintenance schedules be changed to preserve generating availability during peak demand? Each decision spends a different form of reserve. Some spend water, some spend money, some spend political agreement, some spend the remaining life of equipment. This is how a percentage becomes a system condition. The headline is 22%. The real story is how little room that percentage leaves for error. To see why, consider 2 futures that begin with the same lake level. In the first, the upper Colorado Basin receives strong snowfall. Spring temperatures remain moderate. Soils are moist enough to allow runoff to reach rivers, and inflow rises toward normal. Lake Powell stabilizes or begins to recover. In the second, snowfall is weak. Warm conditions cause early melting. Dry soils absorb a larger share of the water, and summer evaporation removes more from the reservoir surface. The starting number is identical, the operating outcome is not. That is why official forecasts show ranges rather than one guaranteed line. The reservoir is not moving toward a predetermined date. It is moving through a corridor of possible futures. But the lower it begins, the more dangerous the lower edge of that corridor becomes. 22% also changes what recovery means. A single wet year can raise Lake Powell substantially, especially after an exceptional snow season. But one strong year does not automatically restore the system to historical security. Water may first refill empty spaces created by previous drought. Downstream obligations continue. Upper basin reservoirs may need recovery of their own. Dry soils may absorb part of the next runoff. A high inflow year can improve the dashboard without rebuilding the old buffer. Recovery must be measured not only by whether the lake rises, but by whether it rises enough to restore choices. That is a higher standard. The reservoir can improve and still remain vulnerable. It can move away from minimum power pool and still operate far below the elevation around which contracts, maintenance practices, recreation, and long-term water planning were built. This is why comparisons to full pool can also mislead. Full pool is a legal and engineering reference, but it is not the only meaningful benchmark. The system does not need Lake Powell to remain at 3,700 feet every year to function. Reservoirs are designed to rise and fall. The warning comes from the depth, duration, and repetition of the decline. A low year can be managed. A sequence of low years consumes reserves. A temporary drop can be reversed. A persistent lower baseline changes what normal operations look like. 22% is therefore both a snapshot and a memory. It contains the record of water that did not arrive, water that was released, heat that increased losses, and years in which the basin failed to recover fully before the next demand arrived. Outside the control room, the number appears in physical marks. Boat ramps end above the water. Marinas move. Rock walls reveal pale bands, showing where the reservoir once stood. Side canyons become disconnected. Intake pipes serving nearby communities may require extension. Archaeological landscapes reappear. The shoreline travels farther, from roads built for a higher lake. These are visible consequences, but the electrical consequence is harder to see. A turbine does not display distress on the canyon wall. It simply produces less power under lower head. The reduction appears in operating schedules, energy purchases, and financial reports. The landscape shows the missing water. The grid records the missing work. That distinction is essential because a reservoir at 22% can still look active. Water still glitters behind the dam. Tour boats may still move through sections of the canyon. Transmission lines still carry electricity away from Glen Canyon. Nothing about the scene announces an immediate failure. The danger lies in confusing continued function with unchanged function. A system can keep operating while losing efficiency, flexibility, and resilience. It can look normal to the public, while engineers are already changing how it is run. That is what the headline number means in real life. It means fewer feet of hydraulic head. It means less electricity from each unit of water. It means a smaller buffer above the turbine threshold. It means upstream reservoirs being considered as emergency support. It means more attention to every runoff forecast and every monthly release decision. It means the difference between a dry year and a dangerous year is becoming smaller. 22% is not merely a description of where the water is today. It is a measure of how much uncertainty the system can still absorb tomorrow. And even that is not the most revealing number, because the reservoir percentage tells us how much water remains, but it does not tell us how quickly the power function weakens as the lake approaches the operating floor. For that, we have to stop looking at the size of the reservoir and begin looking at the shrinking column of water above the turbines. The number everyone sees is 22%. The number operators watch is the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the point where normal power generation becomes impossible. Those are not the same measurement. One describes how much water is stored. The other describes how much operating room remains. And as Lake Powell moves lower, that second number begins to control the story. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. At Glen Canyon Dam, minimum power pool is near 3,490 feet above sea level. Below that elevation, the reservoir no longer provides the conditions required to send water through the hydropower system in the normal way. Federal managers have tried to protect a higher target near 3,525 feet because the final 35 feet above minimum power pool are not an ordinary storage zone. They are a narrowing mechanical margin. Seen on a map, 35 feet is almost nothing. Seen from the top of a canyon wall, it can disappear into the landscape. But inside the dam, those feet determine pressure, turbine performance, generating capacity, and how many options remain available to grid operators. That is the first hidden number. The second is not a fixed elevation at all. It is hydraulic head, the usable height difference that allows gravity to turn stored water into electrical power. The basic idea is simple. Water held high behind a dam contains potential energy. When released, it falls through large steel passages called penstocks. The moving water strikes turbine blades. The turbines rotate generators, and the generators produce electricity. The amount of power depends partly on how much water moves through the system and partly on how far that water can fall. As the reservoir surface drops, the fall becomes shorter. The water loses part of its mechanical advantage before it even reaches the turbine. A low lake, therefore, does not behave like a full lake with less water. It behaves like a weaker energy source. The turbine may still spin. The transmission lines may still carry power. The control room may still schedule generation. But every unit of water does less electrical work than it would at a higher elevation. This is where the public image and the engineering reality separate. The public sees a reservoir that still contains trillions of gallons. The machine feels a smaller force. The map shows water. The system is failing at height. That height changes several things at once. First, maximum generating capacity declines. Glen Canyon Dam may be rated for a certain level of production under favorable conditions, but that rating is not a promise at every reservoir elevation. A lower hydraulic head means the plant cannot produce the same output even if the same amount of water is available to pass through the turbines. Second, efficiency changes. Turbines are designed to operate within particular combinations of water flow, pressure, and rotation. As those conditions move away from the preferred range, operators must adjust how the machines are run. Third, the operating envelope narrows. A generator that once had room to increase or decrease output quickly may have less room to move. That matters because hydropower is valuable not only for the electricity it produces over an entire day. It is valuable for the speed with which it can respond during a critical hour. The hidden loss is therefore not measured only in megawatt hours. It is measured in maneuverability. Imagine the Western grid during a summer evening. Solar farms have produced large amounts of electricity through the afternoon. Then the sun begins to fall. Solar output declines. Air conditioners are still running because buildings, pavement, and walls continue releasing stored heat. Grid operators need other sources to rise as solar generation falls. Natural gas plants can help. Batteries can help. Imported electricity can help. Demand reduction can help. Hydropower can also help because operators can change its output quickly when sufficient water and generating head are available. But when Lake Powell is low, that flexible response becomes smaller before it disappears entirely. The dam has not failed. The grid has not collapsed. Yet one of the resources used to absorb sudden change has become less powerful. That is why the most important threshold is not only the exact day the reservoir crosses 3,490 feet. The decline matters throughout the approach. A system does not move from fully healthy to completely unavailable in one instant. It loses strength along the way. That gradual weakening is harder to communicate than a dramatic cutoff because it does not create one clean photograph. There is no single moment when every turbine announces that the margin has narrowed. The change appears in generation tables, efficiency curves, operating restrictions, replacement energy purchases, and increasingly cautious planning. By the time the public sees a famous threshold crossed, many of the consequences have already entered the system. This is also why the phrase minimum power pool can be misleading. It sounds like a boundary beneath which there is no power problem, and above which everything is normal. In reality, it is the final threshold in a longer decline. Above minimum power pool, generation can already be reduced by lower head. Operators can already face more restrictive conditions. Power customers can already need replacement supplies. The closer the reservoir moves toward the line, the less uncertainty the system can tolerate. A weaker runoff forecast matters more. An unexpectedly hot summer matters more. A mechanical outage matters more. A delay in bringing replacement generation online matters more. Low water turns ordinary problems into compound problems because it removes the spare capacity that would normally absorb them. Another hidden number is the rate of descent. A reservoir elevation by itself is a position. The speed at which it is changing reveals pressure. A slow decline gives agencies time to revise release schedules, arrange power purchases, coordinate with upstream reservoirs, and prepare customers. A rapid decline compresses those decisions. The difference between losing 1 foot over several months and losing 1 foot over several days is not cosmetic. It changes how much warning the system receives. It changes whether a forecast can be updated before another action becomes necessary. It changes whether maintenance can be rescheduled. It changes whether replacement electricity must be purchased in advance or under urgent market conditions. The level tells us where the system stands. The rate tells us how quickly the system is running out of choices. Then there is the hidden number behind the hidden number: uncertainty. Federal reservoir forecasts are not predictions carved into stone. They are ranges built from possible inflows, planned releases, weather conditions, snowpack, soil moisture, and operating decisions. Lake Powell may follow the most probable line, but it may also move toward a wetter or drier outcome. When the reservoir is high, the gap between those scenarios may be manageable. When the reservoir is low, the dry edge of the forecast becomes much more dangerous. The same amount of uncertainty now reaches a critical threshold faster. This forces managers to act before they know exactly which future will occur. Release too much water, and the reservoir may fall closer to minimum power pool. Hold back too much water, and pressure shifts downstream toward Lake Mead, water deliveries, ecosystems, and legal obligations. Release more from Flaming Gorge, and Hydropower, and upstream storage declines. Buy replacement power early, and customers may pay for protection that turns out not to be needed. Wait too long, and the hidden number is therefore not just feet. It is the declining value of time. The people affected first are rarely those standing beside the reservoir. They are planners and operators who must replace flexibility before customers notice it is missing. They work at federal power agencies, municipal utilities, tribal utilities, irrigation districts, rural cooperatives, balancing authorities, and transmission control centers. Their first experience of the drought is not an empty faucet or a dark room. It is a smaller block of dependable generation on a schedule. It is a forecast showing less energy available during a high-demand period. It is a call to a market supplier. It is a budget line for replacement electricity. It is a decision about whether to preserve cash, delay maintenance, adjust rates, or warn customers that costs may rise. The physical decline begins in a canyon. The financial decline can appear hundreds of miles away. That pathway matters because federal hydropower is often sold through long-term arrangements to public power customers. These customers may value it not only because it is renewable, but because it has historically been relatively low cost and responsive. When output falls, utilities do not simply replace one electron with another identical electron. They replace a resource with a particular price, timing, and operating character. The substitute may cost more. It may emit more carbon. It may depend on a congested transmission line. It may not be available during the same hour. It may require fuel deliveries. It may last only as long as a battery remains charged. The loss of hydropower is therefore not just a subtraction from the energy total. It changes the shape of the remaining system. This is the central reversal. The headline suggests that the crisis begins when Lake Powell is almost empty. The mechanism shows that the crisis begins when the water loses enough height to change what the dam can do. The reservoir can still look immense. The turbines can still operate. The grid can still function. But the system has already started compensating. It is holding back releases, drawing support from upstream storage, purchasing replacement power, and planning around a smaller margin. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. And the first people to feel it are not necessarily those who lose electricity. They are those who must prevent that loss by spending water, money, and flexibility faster than the system can replace them. The next question is what happens when that invisible adjustment leaves the control room and enters an ordinary home, a utility bill, a summer workplace, and a family trying to keep one room cool after sunset. The mechanism begins high in the Rocky Mountains, long before electricity enters a transmission line, and long before Lake Powell appears on a federal dashboard. Snow falls across the upper Colorado River basin and settles onto forests, plateaus, and high mountain slopes. That snowpack is not simply frozen water waiting to melt. It is the first stage of a storage system spread across an entire landscape. During winter, the basin holds water in place as snow. During spring and early summer, warming temperatures release part of that stored water into streams and tributaries. Those streams feed the Colorado River. The river enters Lake Powell. The reservoir holds part of the flow behind Glen Canyon Dam. Then gravity becomes electricity. That chain sounds straightforward, but every link can weaken before the water reaches the turbine. Snow can be below average. Warm conditions can cause it to melt earlier. Dry soils can absorb more of the meltwater before it reaches a stream. Plants can draw more water from the ground. The atmosphere can pull more moisture from soil and vegetation. Reservoir evaporation can remove another share. By the time runoff arrives at Lake Powell, the amount entering the reservoir can be far smaller than the amount that once appeared on the mountains as snow. This is the first hidden mechanism: runoff efficiency. The basin does not receive electricity from snowpack. It receives electricity from the portion of snowpack that survives the journey into the river, reaches the reservoir, remains stored at a useful elevation, and then passes through the dam at the right time. A mountain can look white in winter and still deliver disappointing runoff in spring. That is why snow totals alone cannot explain what happens to Lake Powell. The condition of the land matters. When soils are dry, they behave like a sponge placed beneath melting snow. Water that might once have moved quickly into creeks instead enters the ground. Some of it supports vegetation, some returns to the atmosphere, some reaches the river later, some does not reach it during the operating season at all. This is not wasted water in an ecological sense. It is part of the basin doing what landscapes do, but from the perspective of reservoir storage, it is water that does not become usable elevation behind the dam. The mechanism, therefore, begins with a conversion problem. The basin converts snow into runoff less reliably under warm and dry conditions. Then the reservoir must convert the runoff that does arrive into several different services. It stores water for future release. It helps regulate the timing of flows. It supports downstream deliveries. It creates hydropower. It provides operating flexibility. Each service depends on the same physical resource, but not in the same way. Water volume determines how much can be stored and released. Water elevation determines how effectively that stored water can generate electricity. Timing determines whether the power is available when the grid needs it. The reservoir can lose one of these functions before losing the others. Glen Canyon Dam may still release water downstream after normal hydropower becomes impossible. Lake Powell may still contain a large volume below the minimum power pool. The river does not stop existing when the turbines stop producing. This is what makes the mechanism easy to misunderstand. The power risk is not the same as the water supply risk, although the two are connected. The crucial step occurs at the intake structures in the dam. Water from the reservoir enters large openings positioned below the surface. From there, it moves into steel penstocks that descend through the dam toward the power plant. Gravity accelerates the water. The pressure and movement of that water turn turbine runners. Each turbine is connected to a generator. Inside the generator, rotating magnetic fields create an electrical current. Transformers then raise the voltage, so the electricity can travel efficiently over long distances. Transmission lines carry that power into the wider Western system. At first glance, the water seems to perform one simple action. It falls, turns a machine, and continues downstream. But the amount of electrical power produced depends on three main factors: how much water passes through, how efficiently the equipment converts its energy, and the hydraulic head, meaning the usable height difference driving the flow. As Lake Powell falls, the hydraulic head declines. The same amount of water passing through the plant produces less electricity because it begins the journey with less potential energy. The easiest way to picture this is not as a faucet losing water, but as a weight descending from a lower platform. The weight can still fall, it can still perform work, but it has less distance through which gravity can act. At Glen Canyon, every foot lost from the reservoir surface removes part of that vertical advantage. The effect is gradual. There is no single moment when the power plant changes from strong to weak. Instead, the generating capacity and efficiency erode as the elevation moves downward. Operators can adjust water flow and the number of turbines in service, but they cannot command gravity to provide the missing height. This is where the mechanism moves from the reservoir into the grid. Hydropower has qualities that are not captured by the total number of megawatt-hours generated in a year. A hydropower unit can often change output quickly. That allows operators to respond when demand rises, when another generator trips offline, when solar production falls behind a passing cloud bank, or when evening arrives and sunlight fades while air conditioning demand remains high. The grid must maintain a continuous balance between electricity supply and electricity demand. Too little generation causes frequency to fall. Too much causes it to rise. Large deviations can damage equipment or force automatic protective actions. Most customers never see this balancing process because it occurs every second. Flexible generators help make that invisibility possible. Glen Canyon is one of many resources participating in that system. But when its operating range shrinks, someone else must provide the response it can no longer deliver. The substitute may be a natural gas plant increasing output. It may be a battery discharging stored energy. It may be electricity imported across a transmission path. It may be a utility asking large customers to reduce demand. It may be a combination of all four. Each substitute carries its own limitations. A gas plant needs fuel and may take time to start. A battery can respond quickly, but only while stored energy remains available. Imported power depends on another region having electricity to spare and transmission capacity available to move it. Demand reduction works only if customers can respond at the required moment. The hydropower loss, therefore, does not create one simple replacement problem. It creates a timing problem, a price problem, a transmission problem, and a reliability problem at once. Then the mechanism passes through the market. Federal hydropower from the Colorado River Storage Project has historically been allocated to public power customers under long-term arrangements. When generation from the dams is insufficient to meet those commitments, the power marketing system may need to purchase additional electricity. That replacement energy can be more expensive than the federal hydropower it replaces. The cost can move through contracts and utility budgets before it reaches a household bill. It may appear as a rate adjustment. It may appear as a power cost surcharge. It may reduce money available for maintenance or customer assistance. It may force a small public utility to delay another investment. The reservoir has now traveled from mountain snow into a financial decision. Nothing physical has entered the home yet, but the household is already connected to the mechanism. The next step occurs during heat. As temperatures rise, homes and businesses demand more electricity for cooling. The hottest hours often arrive when the grid is already under pressure. Air conditioners cycle longer. Commercial buildings remain loaded. Water utilities pump more. Data centers continue operating. Hospitals cannot reduce critical systems. At the same time, wildfire can threaten transmission lines. Smoke can reduce solar output. And thermal power plants may face their own operational constraints. Low hydropower does not create those stresses, but it removes one layer of flexibility that helps manage them. This is the difference between a hazard and a compound risk. The drought is one hazard. Extreme heat is another. Fire is another. Transmission congestion is another. Each can be managed individually under favorable conditions. When they occur together, the system must absorb several loads with the same limited set of backup options. The danger is not only low water, it is low water arriving in a system that may need rapid power at exactly the wrong hour. The mechanism also moves backward through time because operators respond before a threshold is crossed. When forecasts show Lake Powell approaching dangerous elevations, reclamation can alter release schedules. Water may be held back temporarily to protect the reservoir. Additional releases may be ordered from upstream facilities such as Flaming Gorge. Those decisions change conditions elsewhere. An upstream reservoir loses part of its own stored water. Downstream releases may be shifted across months. Environmental flows may require careful coordination. Power generation at several facilities can change because the water is moving through the system on a different schedule. This is not simply emergency water being added to one lake. It is the river being operated as a connected machine. Protecting one component redistributes pressure through the others. The entire basin becomes part of the mechanism. By the time low water becomes visible as a turbine problem, the system has already carried load through snowpack, soil moisture, runoff, reservoir storage, dam operations, power markets, and upstream reservoir decisions. This is why the phrase drought reduces hydropower is true but incomplete. Drought does not walk directly into a generator. It enters the snow season. It moves through warm air and dry ground. It appears as runoff that fails to arrive. It lowers a reservoir 1 foot at a time. It reduces the height from which water can fall. It weakens the turbine output. It changes the electricity schedule. It forces another generator or battery to respond. It enters a utility budget. It reaches a bill. Then, on a hot evening, it reaches a room where someone is deciding how long the air conditioner can remain on. The mechanism begins above the basin. It moves through mountains, soil, rivers, reservoirs, steel penstocks, turbines, transformers, transmission lines, contracts, and household decisions. By the time it becomes visible to the person paying for electricity, the system has already been compensating for months or years. And that is where the next part begins, not with a diagram, but with one family, one summer evening, and one electric bill carrying the distant weight of a falling lake. The family does not experience Lake Powell as a reservoir chart. They experience it as a decision made after sunset. The house is still holding the heat of the day. The walls have absorbed it. The roof has absorbed it. The driveway and the street outside are releasing it back into the air. The sun is lower, but the rooms are not cooling quickly. An air conditioner is running in the background, cycling longer than it did in spring. On the kitchen table is an electric bill that has become harder to ignore. The amount is not catastrophic. That is what makes it dangerous. It is simply high enough to force a calculation. How long should the cooling stay on? Which room needs it most? Can the thermostat move up by 2 degrees? Can the family wait until later, when rates may be lower? Can another payment be delayed instead? This is where a distant reservoir enters a human body. The body does not experience drought as a graph. It experiences drought as a room that becomes harder to keep safe. Start with one person. A 72-year-old woman lives in the house with her daughter and grandson. She has high blood pressure and takes medication that can affect how her body handles heat. She spends most of the day in the light. Her body produces heat through normal metabolism, while also absorbing heat from the surrounding air and nearby surfaces. To stay within a safe internal range, her blood vessels widen and her heart works harder to move warm blood toward the skin. She sweats. Evaporation carries some heat away, but this cooling system has limits. If the air is humid, sweat evaporates less efficiently. If she is dehydrated, the body has less fluid available. If the night remains hot, the cardiovascular system receives less time to recover. If the family raises the thermostat to save money, the room may never cool enough to reduce that strain. Nothing in this sequence looks like a power emergency. The lights remain on, the refrigerator continues operating, the television works. Yet the household has already lost part of its safety margin. The mechanism outside has entered the room as cost. Cost changes behavior. Behavior changes exposure. Exposure changes physiology. That is the human pathway. It does not require a blackout. A blackout would be visible and immediate. This pathway is quieter. The utility purchases more expensive replacement electricity because low hydropower provides less low-cost generation and gansing less operating flexibility. The utility spreads that pressure across its budget. Some of the increase may reach customers through rates or power cost adjustments. The household sees a higher bill during the same period when cooling demand is rising. The family responds by using less electricity. In a mild month, that may mean turning off unused lights. During extreme heat, the largest adjustable load is often cooling. A financial signal from the power system becomes a temperature signal inside the home. The woman in the living room does not need to understand hydraulic head for hydraulic head to affect her. She does not need to know the elevation of Lake Powell. She only needs to see the price of keeping the room cool. The daughter making the decision is not careless. She is balancing rent, food, medication, gasoline, school expenses, and electricity. She may know that heat is dangerous. She may also know that missing a payment has consequences. The problem is not a lack of information. It is a lack of margin. The reservoir has lost water margin. The utility has lost power margin. The household has lost financial margin. The body is next. This is not just a chain of impacts. It is the same structural condition, repeating at different scales. Each part of the system can function under normal load. Each becomes vulnerable when there is no buffer left. At first, the woman feels tired. Fatigue is easy to dismiss because it has many causes. Then she develops a headache. She may feel dizzy when standing. Her pulse may rise. She may become less interested in drinking water. If the room remains hot into the night, sleep becomes shallow and fragmented. The body continues working to release heat instead of entering full recovery. By morning, she begins the next hot day with less reserve than she had the day before. The danger is not only the peak temperature, it is the accumulation. The first day can be tolerated. The second is harder. The third begins before the body has repaired the stress of the first two. The danger is not only heat, it is heat repeated over time. Now, place that household inside a neighborhood. Some homes have efficient insulation and modern heat pumps. Others have aging air conditioners, dark roofs, poor ventilation, and windows that leak cooled air. Some residents can pay a larger bill without changing behavior. Others use prepaid electricity plans or face disconnection risk. Some have cars and can reach a cooling center. Others depend on a bus stop with no shade. Some work from home. Others return after an outdoor shift already dehydrated. Some speak the language used in emergency alerts. Others depend on family members to translate. The same outdoor temperature produces different indoor risks because buildings, incomes, health conditions, and transportation determine who can escape it. The forecast shows weather. The body receives load. The daughter checks the thermostat again. It is set higher than the doctor would recommend for a vulnerable older adult during prolonged heat. But lowering it means another hour of heavy electricity use. She opens a window, hoping the evening air will help. Outside, the temperature has fallen only slightly. The walls continue radiating heat. A fan moves air across the room, but a fan does not lower the air temperature. It can improve comfort and help sweat evaporate under some conditions, but if the room becomes extremely hot, moving hot air may not provide enough protection. The body keeps compensating. The woman drinks less because she does not want to make repeated trips to the bathroom. Her medication continues affecting blood pressure. The household does not cross one dramatic line. It moves gradually toward a point where a small additional stress can cause a large consequence. Then the power system sends another signal. The utility announces a critical peak period, or asks customers to conserve during the evening. The request is reasonable. Grid operators are trying to reduce strain, while demand remains high and solar output is declining. Most households can contribute by shifting laundry, dishwashing, or electric vehicle charging. But for this family, the main electrical demand is the one protecting the most vulnerable person in the room. Conservation is no longer an abstract civic action. It is a medical decision. Should they raise the thermostat when the grid needs help? Should they ignore the request and protect the room? Should they leave the house and find a public cooling center? Is the center still open? Is transportation available? Can the woman tolerate the trip? This is where system design meets individual capacity. A grid can issue one message to millions of customers. Those customers do not receive it from the same starting point. The family decides to keep the cooling on. That decision is correct for health, but it increases the next bill. The daughter begins planning around it immediately. Groceries may become simpler. A prescription refill may be delayed. A maintenance problem in the car may wait. The electricity cost has now moved into food, healthcare, and transportation. The pathway widens. A lower reservoir did not directly cause each of those decisions. Hydropower is only one part of electricity pricing, and a household bill reflects fuel costs, infrastructure, regulation, weather, utility structure, and many other forces. The evidence line matters. But when low hydropower raises replacement costs inside a system already under heat-driven demand, it can add pressure at the exact point where vulnerable households have the least ability to absorb it. That is the risk. It is not one cause producing one outcome. It is one lost buffer interacting with several others. The next morning, the woman feels confused. Confusion during heat can be an emergency sign, but it may first look like forgetfulness. She answers a question slowly. She says she is fine. Her daughter notices that her skin is unusually warm. They call a nurse line and are told to cool her quickly and seek medical help if symptoms continue. The air conditioner is lowered. The room begins cooling, but the body does not respond instantly. Heat stored in the body must be released. Circulation must stabilize. Fluids may need to be replaced carefully. If symptoms worsen, the family calls emergency services. Now the pathway enters the hospital. The ambulance arrives in a neighborhood where several other calls are active. Emergency medical crews are seeing dehydration, fainting, worsening heart conditions, and respiratory stress. At the hospital, cooling equipment, diagnostic machines, ventilation systems, elevators, lighting, and electronic records all depend on electricity. The hospital may have backup generators, but backup power is designed for outages, not as a cheap substitute for prolonged grid stress. The facility is also facing higher demand from the same heat that increased the household bill. Staff are treating more patients, while the building consumes more power to maintain safe indoor conditions. The mechanism has moved from reservoir to utility, from utility to home, from home to body, and from body to hospital. The hospital sends the pathway back into the grid because medical facilities cannot simply reduce demand during a critical period. They are priority loads. Water systems are priority loads. Emergency communication centers are priority loads. Cooling centers become priority loads. The more heat pushes vulnerable people out of unsafe homes and into public facilities, the more electricity those facilities require. This is how human vulnerability becomes infrastructure load. The grid is not serving only appliances, it is serving the body through buildings. Every cooled room is a form of protection. Every hospital ventilation system is part of the heat response. Every water pump supplying drinking water is part of the heat response. When hydropower flexibility weakens, the system must find other resources to protect those functions. The family's story can also follow a less dramatic path. The woman may never enter the hospital. She may endure the heat, sleep poorly, drink too little, and recover when temperatures fall. But even then, the cost remains. Her daughter may miss work to monitor her. The grandson may sleep in the living room because it is the only cooled space. Food may spoil faster in a warm kitchen. Stress may rise as the next bill approaches. These consequences rarely appear in a federal reservoir report. They are distributed across household budgets, medical records, work absences, and private decisions. That makes them difficult to count. It does not make them unreal. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. It begins inside the dam as reduced hydraulic head. It begins inside the utility as a smaller block of low-cost power. It begins inside the home as a thermostat moved upward. It begins inside the body as a heart working harder to shed heat. Each step is small enough to overlook. Together, they form a pathway. The most important detail is that the pathway does not affect everyone equally. A wealthy household can pay more, improve insulation, install rooftop solar, purchase a battery, replace an old air conditioner, or leave during extreme heat. A low-income household may have none of those options. A renter may not control the building equipment. An older adult may not recognize early heat illness. A person using electrically powered medical equipment cannot simply conserve. A rural customer may live far from a cooling center. A tribal community may face both high energy costs and infrastructure gaps. The same reduction in hydropower can be absorbed as inconvenience by one household and as danger by another. That difference is not created by weather alone. It is created by the distribution of protection. By evening, the woman is resting in a cooler room. The immediate crisis has passed. The reservoir remains low. The turbines remain operational. The grid remains intact. No single failure explains what happened, but the family has revealed the true shape of the risk. A system can avoid blackout and still transfer stress downward. It can preserve service by raising costs. It can protect the grid while exposing the household. It can keep the hospital powered while sending more people through its doors. The question is no longer whether electricity continues to flow. The question is, who must sacrifice first to keep it flowing? And behind that question is a smaller piece of infrastructure that most people never see, where the next stage of the story becomes mechanical. Because the weak point is not the entire western grid. It is the narrow place where falling water must still enter the dam, turn the turbine, and produce enough flexible power before the remaining margin disappears. The weak point is not the whole western power system. The weak point is the narrow mechanical pathway where falling water must still enter Glen Canyon Dam, move through the penstocks, turn the turbines, and leave enough operating room for the plant to respond when the grid suddenly needs more power. From the outside, the dam looks massive enough to resist almost anything. Its concrete wall rises hundreds of feet above the river. Its transmission lines stretch toward distant communities. Its reservoir extends deep into the canyon country of Utah and Arizona. Nothing about the structure appears small, but system failures rarely begin with the largest visible object. They begin where one essential function depends on a limited range of physical conditions. At Glen Canyon, that range is defined by water elevation, intake geometry, hydraulic head, turbine performance, and the ability to release water safely through the equipment. The small hinge is the turbine intake. Under normal conditions, the reservoir surface sits high enough above the intake structures to provide strong and stable pressure. Water enters the dam through large openings, travels down steel penstocks, and reaches the turbine runners with enough force to keep the generators operating within their intended range. Engineers can select how many units are running. Operators can raise or lower output to follow electricity demand. The plant can supply energy over the day and respond quickly when another part of the grid changes. That is the normal role of the system. It is not simply a pipe carrying water. It is a controllable conversion point between stored elevation and electrical flexibility. As Lake Powell falls, that relationship changes. The intake does not suddenly stop working when the reservoir loses one particular foot. The problem develops gradually. The water column above the turbine becomes shorter. Hydraulic pressure declines. The flow conditions reaching the turbines move farther from the combinations for which the machinery performs best. Operators can compensate within limits, but each adjustment narrows the remaining envelope. A machine designed to operate across a broad range begins working inside a smaller one. The danger is not only that generation may eventually stop, the danger is that the plant becomes less useful before that moment arrives. A turbine can still rotate while producing less power. A generator can still remain connected while offering less reserve. A dam can still release water while losing the ability to convert that release into the same amount of electricity. Continued operation can hide declining capability. The first mechanical concern is efficiency. Turbines are engineered around specific relationships between head, water flow, rotational speed, and electrical load. When the reservoir elevation drops, operators may need to pass more water to produce the same amount of electricity that a higher reservoir could produce with less. But water is not unlimited, and release schedules are constrained by downstream requirements, reservoir protection, environmental needs, and basin agreements. The plant cannot simply solve lower head by pushing unlimited water through the turbines. Every additional acre-foot released lowers the reservoir further unless inflow replaces it. The attempted solution can deepen the condition that created the problem. This is the trap. Low water reduces power per unit of flow. Increasing flow can support generation temporarily, but it spends storage faster. Holding water protects elevation, but it limits how much electricity can be produced. The system is forced to choose which form of margin to preserve. The second concern is turbine stability. When water reaches a turbine under conditions far from its preferred operating range, pressure can change unevenly around the blades. Tiny vapor bubbles may form in low-pressure zones and then collapse violently as they move into higher-pressure water. This process is called cavitation. It does not look like a dramatic explosion. It acts more like repeated microscopic hammer blows against metal surfaces. Over time, it can pit turbine blades, increase vibration, reduce efficiency, and accelerate wear. Cavitation can occur in many hydraulic machines, and engineers manage it through design, monitoring, and operating limits. The risk at a low reservoir is not that every turbine will immediately destroy itself. The risk is that the safe combinations of flow and output become more restricted. Operators must avoid settings that create damaging conditions. That means a unit may technically remain available while being unable to operate everywhere the grid would like it to operate. The weak point is not merely whether the turbine is on. It is whether the turbine can move freely between different levels of output without crossing mechanical limits. This matters most during fast changes. Imagine a summer evening when electricity demand remains high after the sun begins to set. Solar production declines rapidly. A natural gas plant elsewhere on the system unexpectedly trips offline. At the same time, wildfire smoke reduces solar output in another region, or a transmission line becomes constrained. Grid operators need replacement power within minutes. Under healthier reservoir conditions, Glen Canyon may be able to increase generation quickly, depending on available water and operating schedules. Under lower head, the plant may have less upward range. Some turbines may already be near the maximum output allowed by the current elevation. Others may need to remain within a narrower efficiency zone. The electricity is not completely absent. The response is smaller. In a large grid, that difference may be covered by other resources, but each substitute uses another piece of system margin. A battery discharges. A gas unit burns more fuel. Imported power occupies transmission capacity. A customer reduces demand. One weak point activates several backup systems at once. The intake therefore becomes a hinge between water security and electrical reliability. If the hinge weakens, the door may remain standing, but it becomes harder to move when needed. The next weakness lies immediately downstream of the turbine. Electricity generated at Glen Canyon must pass through transformers, switchyards, and transmission lines before it can serve customers. Those components do not fail because Lake Powell is low, but lower hydropower changes how they are used. When Glen Canyon produces less, replacement power may need to travel over different routes. Transmission lines that were not carrying the missing electricity may take on additional transfers. Power may come from farther away. Market purchases may depend on paths that are already busy during regional heat. The vulnerability shifts from the dam to the network. The weak point is still small, but it moves. A constrained transmission corridor can prevent available generation from reaching the area that needs it. A transformer outage can reduce local capacity. A wildfire near a high-voltage line can force operators to reroute flows. The loss of hydropower does not create those hazards. It removes one of the options used to work around them. That is how a reservoir problem becomes a grid problem without causing one direct blackout. The system becomes more dependent on every remaining component working as planned. Then the chain reaches the utilities that buy federal hydropower. A municipal utility or rural cooperative may normally receive part of its electricity through long-term arrangements tied to the Colorado River Storage Project. That hydropower can form only a portion of its total supply, but it may be a valuable portion because of its cost and flexibility. When production declines, the utility must replace the shortfall. Large utilities may have diverse portfolios, trading staff, generation assets, and access to several markets. A small utility may have fewer choices. It may purchase power at a higher price during the exact hours when regional demand is strongest. It may have limited ability to negotiate favorable terms. It may spread costs across a relatively small number of customers. The weak point is no longer a turbine blade. It is a procurement contract signed under pressure. If the replacement cost persists, the utility faces another set of choices: raise rates, add a temporary surcharge, reduce financial reserves, delay maintenance, postpone grid upgrades, cut customer assistance. None of those decisions stops electricity from flowing immediately, but each removes protection from the future. Delayed vegetation management can increase outage risk. Deferred transformer replacement can leave aging equipment in service longer. Smaller assistance programs can expose more households to disconnection. Reduced reserves can make the utility less capable of responding to the next emergency. The original stress began as falling water. It passes through a turbine intake and emerges as postponed maintenance hundreds of miles away. This is what system expansion looks like at the scale of one weak component. A narrow operating margin at the dam creates narrow financial margins elsewhere. The chain also reaches water infrastructure. Many communities depend on electricity to pump, treat, and distribute water. Pumps move groundwater from wells. Treatment plants run motors, filters, chemical systems, controls, and monitoring equipment. Wastewater facilities operate continuously. During extreme heat, water demand can rise while electricity demand rises with it. If power becomes more expensive, water utilities face higher operating costs. If the grid enters an emergency, pumping schedules may need adjustment. Backup generators can protect critical facilities, but fuel supplies and maintenance determine how long those generators remain useful. The irony is difficult to miss. A drought that weakens hydropower can raise the cost of operating the pumps used to move scarce water. One part of the water system begins consuming more financial and electrical effort because another part has lost elevation. Hospitals face a similar problem. They do not depend on Glen Canyon alone, and they are generally protected as critical loads. But critical status does not create electricity. It determines priority when the system is strained. Hospitals must maintain cooling, ventilation, refrigeration, imaging equipment, laboratories, elevators, lighting, communications, and medical devices. During heat, they may see more patients at the same time that their buildings require more power. Backup generation protects against outages, but hospitals cannot operate indefinitely as isolated islands without fuel, maintenance, and functioning supply chains. The stronger the wider grid remains, the safer the hospital remains. Each lost source of flexible generation makes that protection slightly harder to maintain. The weak point at the dam is therefore connected to the weak point inside the hospital generator room. The same pattern appears in data centers, food warehouses, irrigation pumping stations, nursing homes, and emergency communication facilities. Each has a component small enough to determine whether the larger service continues: a cooling pump, a transformer, a fuel delivery, a control system, a battery bank. a single transmission connection. Most days, redundancy hides those dependencies. Stress reveals them. The danger is not that Lake Powell directly shuts down every facility. The danger is that the reservoir decline removes one layer of redundancy from a system already made of narrow dependencies. A healthy system survives a failed component because another component takes over. A stressed system asks the backup to become permanent. That is when backup capacity stops being backup. Consider the upstream reservoirs being used to protect Lake Powell. Releasing additional water from Flaming Gorge can raise or preserve Lake Powell's elevation relative to what it would otherwise be. But the operation reduces storage upstream. Flaming Gorge has its own power plant, environmental obligations, recreation economy, and future drought exposure. Water released today cannot be released again next year, unless the reservoir receives enough inflow to replace it. The protective action does not eliminate scarcity, it relocates it through time and space. The weak point at Glen Canyon begins drawing support from other parts of the basin. If dry conditions continue, those supporting reservoirs may lose their own operating margin. A system, designed with several reservoirs, can spread risk, but repeated drought can cause all of them to weaken together. The backup reservoir becomes part of the primary emergency. That is the larger chain of consequences. Lake Powell falls, hydraulic head declines, turbine performance narrows. Flexible generation weakens, replacement power becomes more important. Transmission routes carry different loads. Utilities face higher costs. Maintenance or assistance is delayed. Households receive more pressure. Critical facilities depend more heavily on the remaining grid. Upstream reservoirs surrender storage to defend the intake. Every link may continue functioning, yet the system as a whole becomes less able to absorb the next surprise. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the small component whose limits force every other component to work harder. At Glen Canyon, that component is the path between the reservoir surface and the turbine runner. It normally converts height into electricity. Under deep drought, it converts water scarcity into operating restriction. What makes this more than a theoretical concern is that the basin has already moved dangerously close to this configuration before. Federal agencies have already changed releases, moved water from upstream storage, purchased replacement electricity, and prepared for conditions once treated as remote. The evidence is not waiting somewhere in the future. A version of this mechanism has already left marks in budgets, reservoir plans, turbine studies, and emergency operating decisions. To understand what the present warning means, the next step is to return to the years when Lake Powell approached its lowest modern elevations and examine what the system was forced to do before the turbines ever stopped. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In the spring of 2022, Lake Powell crossed below an elevation that federal managers had worked to protect for years. The reservoir fell beneath 3,525 feet above sea level, leaving less than 35 feet between the water surface and minimum power pool. The turbines were still operating. Electricity was still leaving Glen Canyon Dam. Homes remained lit. But the system had moved into territory that once belonged mostly to contingency plans. The warning was no longer a distant curve on a model, it was an observed elevation on a federal gauge. To understand why that moment matters now, it is necessary to remember what came before it. The Colorado River Basin had already endured more than 2 decades marked by drought, high temperatures, weak runoff, and repeated failure to rebuild the reservoir storage consumed during dry years. Lake Powell had fallen before. During the severe drought of the early 2000s, the reservoir lost more than 100 feet of elevation in only a few years. By the spring of 2005, its pale bathtub ring towered above the water. Boat ramps had become difficult to use, and the lake had reached one of its lowest points since filling. Yet the system still possessed more distance above minimum power pool than it would face nearly 2 decades later. That earlier drought demonstrated how quickly a massive reservoir could shrink. The 2022 episode demonstrated something more operationally dangerous, how close the decline could bring the power plant to a threshold that had shaped emergency planning but had never been crossed during the dam's generating history. The similarities are important. Both periods followed sequences of dry conditions rather than one isolated bad month. Both showed that a large reservoir can lose elevation faster than the public expects when inflow remains weak and releases continue. Both exposed the difference between snow in the mountains and water that actually reaches the reservoir. Both required agencies to operate with uncertainty about the next winter, but the differences are just as important. In the early 2000s, the reservoirs began from a stronger position. By 2022, much of the historical storage cushion had already been consumed. Another dry year was not landing on a full system. It was landing on a system that had failed to recover fully from previous dry years. The event was not simply another drought. It was drought, arriving after the buffer had been spent. Federal agencies responded before Lake Powell reached minimum power pool. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, water stored in upstream units of the Colorado River Storage Project could be released toward Lake Powell when projections showed the reservoir approaching critical elevations. In 2021 and 2022, additional releases totaling roughly 661,000 acre-feet were arranged from upstream storage, including Flaming Gorge Reservoir. 500,000 acre-feet were scheduled through the 2022 operation alone. That amount of water is difficult to picture, but its purpose was precise. It was not intended to refill Lake Powell. It was intended to add vertical protection. The operation was designed to reduce the risk that the reservoir would lose the elevation needed for hydropower and other critical functions. The distinction matters. A rescue measured in hundreds of thousands of acre-feet can sound like abundance. In the context of Lake Powell, it was a defensive move to preserve a narrow band of operating space. The water did not appear from a new storm or a newly discovered source. It came from storage already held somewhere else in the basin. Flaming Gorge had to give up part of its reserve so that Glen Canyon could preserve more of its own. The intervention proved that the reservoirs could support one another. It also proved that the threat had become serious enough to activate that support. This is what historical precedent reveals. The system did not wait for the turbines to stop. It began spending backup water while they were still turning. Reclamation also changed operations at Glen Canyon Dam. Monthly releases were adjusted to retain more water in Lake Powell during critical periods. The goal was to slow the decline and protect the elevation above minimum power pool. But holding water in Lake Powell is not a consequence-free action. Water released from Glen Canyon contributes to Lake Mead and to the wider set of downstream obligations and uses across the lower Colorado River Basin. Reducing one release can preserve elevation upstream while increasing pressure downstream. The agencies were not choosing between a good outcome and a bad outcome. They were choosing which danger required the most immediate attention. That is one of the clearest lessons from 2022. Reservoir operations under deep drought are not about finding extra water. They are about deciding where limited water can prevent the greatest near-term damage. The power system was preparing at the same time. The Western Area Power Administration markets electricity from Glen Canyon and other federal hydroelectric facilities in the Colorado River Storage Project. As hydropower production falls, WAPA may need to purchase additional electricity to meet contractual commitments. During the drought, the agency and its customers began planning around the possibility that Glen Canyon generation could decline sharply or disappear for months or years if Lake Powell fell below the generation threshold. WAPA identified the potential need for hundreds of millions of dollars in additional financial capacity connected to replacement power, transmission, operations, and the risk of persistent drought. That figure was not a prediction that every dollar would be spent. It was evidence of the scale agencies believed they might need to manage if the reservoir crossed the line. The threat had moved from hydrology into finance. A foot of missing elevation had become a reserve requirement. A weak runoff forecast had become a question about market purchases. A reservoir decline had entered the budgets of an electrical system. The power did not disappear all at once during that period. Instead, hydropower availability weakened while wholesale electricity markets were already experiencing volatility. WAPA purchased energy to supplement federal generation. Its customers also examined how they would replace hydropower through their own portfolios. For some, the concern was price. For others, it was whether replacement electricity would be available during the right hours. The customers were not identical. They included municipalities, rural cooperatives, tribal utilities, irrigation districts, and public agencies operating across different markets and transmission conditions. A large organization might absorb a temporary increase through reserves or a diverse power portfolio. A smaller utility could face a more direct financial shock. The same lost generation could therefore create very different consequences depending on who had to replace it. This is another lesson the precedent left behind. System risk is not distributed according to the size of the physical event. It is distributed according to the strength of the institutions receiving the load. Then, an unusually wet winter changed the immediate picture. The mountain snowpack of 2023 produced strong runoff across parts of the upper Colorado River basin. Lake Powell rose dramatically from its low point. The increase moved the reservoir farther from minimum power pool and reduced the immediate risk of losing hydropower. Headlines shifted, boat ramps reopened. The visible emergency appeared to ease. But the wet year also created a dangerous opportunity for misunderstanding. A reservoir can rise quickly without returning to the conditions around which the original system was built. One strong runoff season cannot automatically erase more than 2 decades of accumulated deficit. It cannot refill every upstream reservoir, restore every financial reserve, reverse long-term warming, and guarantee that the next winter will also be wet. The 2023 recovery was real. So was its limit. It demonstrated that snow can still produce major relief. It did not demonstrate that the basin had returned to the old baseline. This difference between relief and recovery is central to the present story. Relief moves a system away from an immediate threshold. Recovery restores enough margin to survive the next sequence of stress. Lake Powell received relief. Whether the wider basin recovered depended on what happened afterward. Dry years resumed drawing down storage. The reservoir began moving toward the same operating conversation again. This is why history does not repeat as one identical event. It echoes through the decisions agencies are forced to make. Upstream releases, changed monthly operations, replacement power planning, financial reserves, negotiations between competing needs. Each action taken in 2022 now exists as evidence that the mechanism is real. The lake did not have to cross minimum power pool for low elevation to affect the power system. The response itself was the impact. Water was relocated. Electricity planning changed. Money was reserved. Customers prepared for higher replacement costs. Engineers studied operating conditions closer to the intake. The absence of a turbine shutdown does not mean nothing happened. It means the system spent resources to prevent the shutdown. This distinction is often lost in public discussions of disaster. When an emergency measure works, the feared event may not occur. Observers can then conclude that the warning was exaggerated. But successful prevention is not proof that the risk was imaginary. It can be proof that the intervention arrived in time. In 2022, Lake Powell remained above minimum power pool. That outcome depended partly on hydrology, partly on reduced releases, partly on upstream support, and partly on coordinated federal action. The margin was defended. It was not guaranteed. The historical record also warns against making the opposite mistake. Because the reservoir approached the threshold once, it does not follow that every later decline will produce the same schedule or the same consequence. Inflow can improve. Operating plans can change. Batteries, solar generation, natural gas plants, demand response, and regional electricity markets can provide replacement flexibility. Transmission expansion can reduce some constraints. Water conservation can alter reservoir trajectories. Future policy can change how shortages are shared. The present is not trapped inside the year 2022, but neither is it free from the mechanism that year exposed. Lower elevation still reduces hydraulic head. Reduced hydropower still requires replacement. Upstream support still consumes storage somewhere else. One wet year still does not guarantee long-term recovery. The precedent does not tell us exactly what will happen next. It tells us which parts of the system will begin moving first. Before the turbines stop, planners buy electricity. Before the reservoir crosses the line, upstream water is released. Before customers see a blackout, utilities absorb costs. Before the public hears the word failure, agencies are already rearranging the basin to avoid it. That is the evidence left behind. The most important lesson from the past is not that Glen Canyon Dam nearly stopped generating. It is that the entire system began changing behavior while generation continued. The warning entered contracts before it entered homes. It entered reservoir schedules before it entered transmission lines. It entered federal budgets before it entered the public imagination. And when a wet year pulled Lake Powell away from the edge, the machinery of risk did not disappear. It remained inside the plans, waiting to be activated again if the water returned to the same narrow band. That is where the current decline meets its historical echo. The lake is not approaching an unknown problem. It is approaching a problem the system has already rehearsed, but has not permanently solved. The next question is larger than whether emergency operations can protect Glen Canyon one more time. It is whether a network built to use drought measures as temporary defenses can continue relying on them as the climate, the river, and the power grid move toward a different baseline. This is not only a reservoir decline, it is a test of whether a water and power system built around the climate of the 20th century can continue operating under the conditions of the 21st. For most of the modern era, the Colorado River system was managed around a familiar, seasonal sequence. Snow accumulated in the mountains during winter. Spring warmth released that snow into rivers. Reservoirs captured part of the runoff. Water was moved across months and years. Hydropower converted, stored elevation into electricity when the grid needed it. The system was designed to smooth natural variability. Wet periods filled the account. Dry periods withdrew from it. The problem now is not that variability has disappeared. The problem is that the withdrawals are arriving more often, recovery is becoming less reliable, and the old calendar is losing its authority. The basin can receive a respectable snowpack and still produce disappointing runoff. Warm temperatures can cause snow to melt earlier. Dry soils can absorb more water before it reaches a stream. Plants can use more moisture. The atmosphere can demand more from the landscape. A winter that looks reassuring in the mountains may deliver less water to Lake Powell than managers once expected from similar snow totals. This is a change in the conversion between weather and supply. The system was built to store runoff. It is now being asked to store water that increasingly fails to arrive in the same proportion. That is the new pattern. The headline is Drought. The deeper story is declining recovery efficiency. A reservoir can survive a dry year if a wet year follows. It can survive several dry years if the wet years rebuild what was lost. But when warm conditions reduce the amount of runoff produced by a given snowpack, the recovery year itself becomes weaker. The system may receive relief without restoration. Lake Powell can rise sharply and still remain far below the elevations that once provided broad operating freedom. One good year can move the reservoir away from a threshold. It may not return the basin to security before the next dry sequence begins. This is how an emergency measure becomes part of the baseline. Upstream releases that were designed as temporary protection may be considered again. Monthly operations may be adjusted again. Replacement electricity may be purchased again. Each intervention can succeed in the short term, while revealing that the larger system is not recovering on its own. A temporary defense becomes routine when the condition requiring it keeps returning. That transition matters because emergency tools are rarely designed for permanent use. Flaming Gorge can support Lake Powell, but it cannot repeatedly release stored water without affecting its own elevation. Utilities can purchase replacement power, but they cannot assume market prices will always remain affordable. Households can conserve during one critical period, but vulnerable residents cannot treat safe cooling as an optional load every summer. Maintenance can be delayed once. Financial reserves can be spent once. A battery can discharge once before it must be charged again. Every backup contains a recovery requirement. The Western system is increasingly being tested not only by peak stress, but by whether enough time remains to recharge the backups before the next load arrives. This is where the reservoir decline becomes a calendar failure. The old calendar separated hazards. Snowmelt arrived in spring. Peak electricity demand arrived in summer. Wildfire risk increased later in the dry season. Reservoirs carried water across those periods. The grid could prepare for one challenge before the next reached its maximum. That sequence is becoming less dependable. Snow can melt earlier. Heat can arrive before reservoirs receive their strongest inflow. Fire seasons can begin sooner and last longer. Evening electricity demand can remain high after solar production declines. Drought can weaken hydropower during the same months when cooling demand rises. The system is not merely facing stronger individual hazards, it is losing the spaces between them. Recovery time is becoming the hidden resource. A transmission line removed from service for wildfire protection may be manageable when demand is moderate and generation is abundant. Low hydropower may be manageable when temperatures are mild and markets have surplus electricity. A heat wave may be manageable when transmission paths are open and flexible generation is available. The risk grows when those conditions overlap. The same megawatt of missing hydropower matters more during extreme heat. The same transmission constraint matters more when replacement power must travel from farther away. The same high market price matters more to a small public utility after several years of drought-related purchases. Compound risk does not require every component to fail. It requires several components to lose margin at the same time. This is why Lake Powell is not an isolated infrastructure story. It sits inside a Western grid that is changing rapidly. Solar generation has expanded. Battery storage is growing. Regional electricity markets are becoming more coordinated. Utilities are adding new transmission and changing the way they plan for extreme conditions. These changes can reduce dependence on any single dam. They can also create new timing challenges. Solar power is strongest during daylight. Demand can remain high into the evening. Batteries can shift electricity across hours, but their duration and state of charge determine how long they can support the system. Wind generation may be strong or weak, depending on weather patterns that do not follow demand. Natural gas plants can provide firm power, but they depend on fuel, supply, equipment availability, and emissions constraints. No replacement is identical to stored water behind a dam. The future grid can function with less hydropower, but only if it replaces both the energy and the flexibility hydropower provided. That distinction is critical. Energy is the total amount of electricity produced over time. Capacity is the amount that can be produced at a particular moment. Flexibility is the ability to change output when conditions shift. A large amount of solar energy during the afternoon does not automatically replace hydropower needed during a fast evening ramp. A battery with enough power to respond quickly may not contain enough stored energy for a long heat event. A gas plant with sufficient capacity may be located behind a congested transmission path. Planning must replace the shape of the resource, not only the annual total. Lake Powell exposes that requirement because its decline removes several services together. It reduces energy production. It narrows peak output. It can reduce rapid response capability. It raises replacement costs. It also affects revenue connected to federal power programs. One falling reservoir therefore reaches hydrology, engineering, electricity markets, public finance, and social vulnerability at the same time. This is what makes the risk systemic. A systemic risk is not simply a large problem. It is a problem that moves through connections. Low runoff reaches the reservoir. Low elevation reaches the turbine. Reduced generation reaches the utility. Higher costs reach the household. Heat exposure reaches the body. Medical demand reaches the hospital. Hospital demand returns to the grid. The pathway can circle back on itself. Each institution experiences only part of the chain, which makes the full pattern difficult to see. Water managers may focus on elevation. Grid operators focus on megawatts. Utilities focus on procurement. Public health agencies focus on heat exposure. Households focus on bills. The system pattern emerges only when those views are placed together. Then the same word appears in every room: margin, water margin, power margin, financial margin, health margin. The climate signal becomes dangerous when it removes all four faster than they can be rebuilt. This does not mean the future is fixed. Systems can adapt. Water conservation can reduce pressure on reservoirs. More efficient buildings can lower cooling demand. Expanded transmission can move electricity across wider regions. Batteries can provide rapid response. Diverse generation can reduce dependence on one source. Better forecasting can improve operating decisions. Rate design and customer assistance can protect vulnerable households. Tribal nations and local communities can be included more fully in planning. Dam equipment can be studied and modified for lower operating conditions where engineering allows. None of these measures restores the old river. They change how much damage a lower river can cause. Adaptation is the difference between accepting a new physical baseline and accepting the same level of vulnerability. But adaptation has its own calendar. Infrastructure projects take time. Transmission lines can require years of planning and permitting. Power plants and storage projects require capital and equipment. Water agreements require negotiation among states, tribes, federal agencies, agricultural users, cities, and environmental interests. Homes are upgraded one building at a time. Low-income households may be the last to receive efficient cooling, even though they face the greatest risk. The physical system can change faster than the institutional system. A reservoir can lose dozens of feet while a transmission project remains on paper. That mismatch is one of the central dangers ahead. The future echo of Lake Powell may therefore appear far beyond the canyon. It may appear at other reservoirs where hydropower depends on declining storage. It may appear in cities where extreme heat increases demand faster than the grid can add firm capacity. It may appear in agricultural regions where electricity costs affect pumping. It may appear in public utilities, forced to choose between replacing power and maintaining local infrastructure. It may appear in tribal Naim, Aiman, Taiman, note, Naim, note, end crease. To the problem while facing high energy burdens and unresolved water rights. It may appear in federal budgets when emergency actions designed for rare conditions become recurring expenses. The specific geography changes. The system pattern remains. A resource, once treated as dependable, begins arriving with conditions. A backup begins operating more often. A threshold, once considered remote, enters annual planning. The old normal survives in contracts and design documents after it has weakened in the physical world. This is not only a drought, it is an infrastructure test against a moving baseline. The question is not whether Lake Powell will return to a particular elevation in one wet year. The question is whether the institutions around it are being redesigned for a river that may deliver less water, less predictably, under greater heat. The system does not need to abandon every old assumption. It needs to identify which assumptions have become expensive to defend. One of those assumptions is that hydropower losses will remain temporary. Another is that upstream reservoirs will always have water available for rescue operations. Another is that replacement electricity will be affordable when every region is experiencing heat at the same time. Another is that households can absorb higher costs without changing medically important behavior. The present decline places each assumption under load. The evidence does not show inevitable collapse. It shows a narrowing range in which the old system can continue behaving as designed. The future will be determined by what replaces that lost range. More storage, more transmission, lower demand, stronger household protection, new water rules, different operating priorities, or repeated emergency measures that consume one reserve after another. By the time Lake Powell reaches the next famous number, the most important decisions may already have been made elsewhere, in utility planning rooms, in state water negotiations, in federal budgets, in building codes, in household assistance programs. The reservoir is the visible gauge. The deeper measurement is whether the West is still planning for yesterday's river. And before the story can end, one final boundary must be drawn. Not every high bill comes from Lake Powell. Not every grid emergency begins with drought. Not every dry year is caused by one factor. The warning becomes stronger, not weaker, when those limits are stated clearly. Because the evidence does not need exaggeration. What the system has already revealed is enough. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Powell is low. Lower water reduces hydraulic head. Reduced hydraulic head weakens the amount of electricity Glen Canyon Dam can produce from the same flow of water. As the reservoir approaches minimum power pool, the operating range narrows, federal managers have fewer choices, and power agencies must prepare for the possibility of purchasing more replacement electricity. Those statements are supported by engineering, operating records, and the actions agencies have already taken. What the evidence does not support is the claim that every power bill in the West is rising because of Lake Powell, that one reservoir decline will automatically cause a regional blackout, or that every future dry year will push the lake across the same threshold on the same date. Those claims go beyond what the data can show. The system is connected, but connection is not the same as single cause. Electricity prices are shaped by fuel costs, transmission limits, generation outages, regulation, market conditions, local utility decisions, and weather. Grid reliability depends on thousands of generators, lines, transformers, control systems, and human decisions spread across a vast region. Lake Powell is one important part of that network. It is not the entire network. A falling reservoir can remove flexibility without directly causing failure. It can raise replacement costs without producing the same bill increase for every customer. It can increase risk during heat without guaranteeing that an outage will occur. This distinction matters because the strongest warning is not the most dramatic sentence. It is the most accurate description of how much margin has been lost. Climate evidence also requires a boundary. Rising temperatures have intensified aridity across the Colorado River Basin and increased the amount of water demanded by soils, plants, and the atmosphere. Warming can reduce the runoff produced by a given amount of snow. It can accelerate snowmelt, extend evaporation, and make dry conditions more damaging. But no single reservoir level is created by temperature alone. Lake Powell reflects snowfall, rainfall, soil moisture, upstream consumption, reservoir releases, legal obligations, operating decisions, and the sequence of wet and dry years that came before. Climate change is part of the mechanism. It is not a substitute for explaining the entire mechanism. Saying that clearly does not weaken the argument. It prevents the argument from becoming something the evidence cannot carry. The same rule applies to the human pathway. A higher electricity bill can lead a vulnerable household to reduce cooling. Reduced cooling can increase heat exposure. Heat exposure can worsen cardiovascular stress, dehydration, and other medical conditions. But a single family's medical emergency cannot be traced back to one reservoir without detailed evidence about that household, that utility, that rate structure, and that day. The pathway is a documented risk, not a guaranteed sequence for every person. It shows how physical scarcity can travel through cost and behavior into health. It does not claim that Lake Powell alone determines who becomes ill. The warning becomes useful when it identifies the pathway without inventing certainty. There is another boundary between low power production and grid collapse. Glen Canyon Dam is not the only flexible resource in the West. Natural gas plants can increase output. Batteries can discharge. Other hydropower facilities can respond. Electricity can move across regional markets. Utilities can reduce demand or call on customers to shift use. New resources are being added. Operators plan for equipment outages and uncertain weather every day. These defenses matter. They are the reason a reduction at one dam does not instantly become darkness across several states. But defenses are not infinite. Gas plants can fail. Batteries can empty. Transmission lines can become congested or threatened by wildfire. Neighboring regions may be experiencing the same heat and may have little electricity to spare. Demand reduction may reach people whose loads cannot safely be reduced. The evidence does not say the grid will fail. It says the grid must work harder when one flexible resource weakens during the same period that other stresses rise. That is a risk statement, not a prophecy. The difference is essential. Prophecy tells the audience that the outcome is fixed. Risk analysis shows which conditions make an outcome more likely and which interventions can reduce it. Lake Powell may rise after a strong snow season. Water managers may change releases. Utilities may add storage, transmission, and other generation. Conservation may slow the decline. New agreements may reduce pressure on the reservoirs. Engineers may improve the ability of equipment to operate at lower elevations. None of these possibilities erases the current warning. They explain why the future remains open. The reservoir is not moving toward one unavoidable ending. It is moving through a narrowing range of choices. The question is, who acts before the range becomes smaller still? Return now to the federal screen where this story began. The display shows elevation, inflow, release, storage, and forecast bands. No line on that screen contains the entire future. The elevation line tells managers where the water stands. The inflow line tells them what the river is delivering. The release line shows what the system is sending downstream. The forecast bands describe possible paths rather than promises. The critical thresholds identify where machinery and operating rules begin to change. At the beginning, 22% looked like the central fact. It was large, visible, and easy to repeat. Now it looks different. The percentage is only the outer surface of the story. Beneath it is the shrinking height above the turbines. Beneath that is the declining energy carried by each unit of water. Beneath that is a smaller block of flexible electricity. Beneath that is a utility searching for replacement power. Beneath that is a household deciding whether safe cooling is affordable. The reservoir number was never only about the reservoir. But that does not mean every event downstream can be blamed on it. The system is more complicated than a single chain of cause and effect. It is a network of pressures that can reinforce one another. Low runoff reduces storage. Low storage weakens hydropower. Heat raises electricity demand. Wildfire threatens transmission. High market prices strain utilities. Higher bills strain households. Health emergencies increase demand at hospitals. Hospitals require reliable power. Each link can exist separately. The danger grows when several arrive together, and the same backup resources are expected to solve all of them. This is the pattern Lake Powell reveals. Not certain collapse. Declining redundancy. Not one dramatic failure. A series of smaller margins disappearing from water, power, finance, and health at the same time. That is why the most important event may never appear as one breaking news alert. It may be a planning decision delayed by a year. A transmission project that arrives after the reservoir has fallen farther. A utility reserve spent on replacement power instead of transformer upgrades. An upstream reservoir released again before it has fully recovered. A family that conserves electricity during the wrong hour because the bill has become too high. These are not cinematic failures. They are the slow transfer of stress from one part of the system to another. Eventually, the stress reaches the component with the least ability to absorb it. The future will not be decided only at 3,490 feet. That line matters because it marks the end of normal hydropower production. But the system is being shaped before the lake reaches it. Every foot lost changes generation. Every emergency release spends storage somewhere else. Every replacement purchase changes a budget. Every delayed investment changes the next emergency. Waiting for the final threshold would mean ignoring the long decline that made the threshold dangerous. The event will pass in one form or another. A wet year may raise the reservoir. An operating change may buy time. A new agreement may reduce releases. New batteries and transmission may replace part of the lost flexibility. But the thing this moment revealed will remain. A system built around deep reservoirs, predictable runoff, and long recovery periods is being tested by a river that no longer follows the old calendar with the same reliability. That does not mean the system is doomed. It means the design question has changed. The old question was how to divide an abundant but variable river across seasons and states. The new question is how to preserve essential services when the river produces less usable margin than the system was built to expect. The answer will not come from one dam or one technology. Water conservation alone cannot replace electrical flexibility. Batteries alone cannot refill a reservoir. A wet winter alone cannot resolve decades of allocation and demand. The response must connect the same systems the risk connects. Water rules must recognize power consequences. Grid planning must recognize hydrologic limits. Utility regulation must recognize household vulnerability. Heat planning must recognize that cooling is critical infrastructure inside a home. The future depends on whether institutions can see the full pathway before another emergency forces them to. At the start of this story, the warning appeared as a quiet line of federal data. Lake Powell near 22% capacity. The reservoir still holding trillions of gallons. The turbines still turning. The lights still on. That image is more unsettling now because continued operation no longer looks like proof of safety. It looks like a system using its remaining room carefully. The dam is working. The agencies are responding. The grid is adapting. And every one of those actions is evidence that the margin matters. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a grid margin test moving downstream. The final question is not whether the West can prevent one threshold crossing in one season. It is whether water managers, power planners, utilities, and communities can rebuild flexibility faster than the river removes it. Because the next warning may not arrive when Lake Powell reaches a famous line. It may arrive earlier, in the moment the system discovers that the backup water, replacement electricity, financial reserves, and household tolerance it expected to use are all being called upon at once. The future will not be decided only by the lowest number on the reservoir gauge. It will be decided by whether the system still has time to recover before the next load arrives.